The sandstorm arrived faster than any forecast predicted. Wind screamed through the headset, sand hammering against the scope
Wind is
like
reading
hail,
30 knots.
and the
Adjust for
formation
dust.
ahead gradually vanished from the
Target
screen.
acquired.
A squad
Stabilize.
caught in ambush
Taking
at
a
an
shot.
open position, where visibility shrank to mere meters and every coordinate became meaningless. In the command center, a general stared at the static-filled monitor and asked quietly, "Who taught you to shoot?" She didn't answer. She adjusted her scope, read the wind direction, and squeezed the trigger from a distance where sandstorms forgive no mistakes. The weather brief at Aero 430 had mentioned wind, light gusts, maybe 15 knots by noon, nothing the drone network couldn't handle, nothing that would ground operations or force a scrub. Lieutenant Marcus Hale remembered that number 15 because he'd written it in grease pencil on the laminated map tucked into his vest. Standard practice: wind speed, temperature, humidity, variables that mattered when you were moving through an open desert with no cover except the folds in ancient riverbeds and the occasional cluster of sun-bleached rocks. At Joe 600, when his squad inserted via twin Blackhawks 3 clicks west of the target compound, the wind was already 25 knots. Still manageable. The helicopters banked hard and low, rotors kicking up their own temporary storm before pulling away into the pale pre-dawn sky. By 0730, the wind was 40 knots and climbing. Hale felt it first in the way his body armor shifted against his shoulders. Not just breeze, but pressure, constant and building. The kind of wind that got into your ears and stayed there, a low roar that turned all other sounds into echoes. Sand began lifting off the desert floor in sheets, not clouds. Horizontal ribbons that stung exposed skin and found every gap in goggles, every seal in equipment. Falcon 6, Viper 1, Hale transmitted, using the tactical frequency reserved for situation updates. Winds picking up faster than expected, visibility degrading. The response came through clear enough. Captain David Reeves, commanding the operation from the forward operating base 15 kilometers to the south, sounded calm. He always did. Copy, Viper 1. Weather update shows system intensifying earlier than projected. Continue to objective. We'll monitor. Hale acknowledged and kept moving. His squad 8 men trained to operate in conditions most people couldn't imagine, tightened their formation and pushed forward. They'd trained in dust, they'd trained in heat, they'd trained in situations where you couldn't see your hand at arm's length. But training assumed you knew when the bad weather would hit. Training assumed the forecast was close. This wasn't close. By 0800, the horizon disappeared entirely. The desert, which moments ago had been a vast expanse of tan and ochre, collapsed into a sphere of amber haze, no more than 20 meters across. Beyond that, nothing. Sky and ground merged into a single oppressive wall of moving particles. The GPS still worked, the radio still worked, but the world itself had shrunk to what you could touch. Hale called a halt. The squad dropped into a defensive crouch, weapons outward, backs to the wind. Through his goggles, which were already scratched from the sand despite being new that morning, he could barely make out the silhouette of Corporal Ethan Boyd, his point man 3 meters ahead. Falcon 6, Viper 1, we need to reassess. Hale kept his voice level, professional, no panic. Visibility near zero, can't confirm terrain features. Request hold position until conditions improve. Static answered him. Then Reeves's voice, more fragmented now. A copy. Storm cell. Passing through. Estimate 45 minutes. Say again, Falcon 6, you're breaking up. Hold position. Will advise. The transmission cut entirely. Hale tried twice more, got nothing but white noise and the occasional burst of carrier signal. He switched to the backup frequency, then the emergency channel. Same result. The storm wasn't just blinding them, it was isolating them. He looked at Boyd, who had crawled back close enough for hand signals. Boyd pointed at his radio and shook his head. Same problem. They were alone. Sergeant Kyle Porter, the squad's senior NCO, low crawled up beside Hale. His voice was nearly lost in the wind, even though their heads were inches apart. We should dig in, wait it out. It was the right call. In conditions like this, movement was suicide. You couldn't navigate, couldn't maintain formation, couldn't defend yourselves if contact came. The smart thing was to find the lowest ground available, form a tight perimeter, and wait for the storm to pass. Hale was about to give that order when the sound changed. Not the wind was constant, a freight train that never stopped. But underneath it, a new rhythm, mechanical. Engines, multiple engines, moving perpendicular to their position. Boyd heard it too. He was already bringing his rifle up, scanning through the murk in the direction of the sound. But there was nothing to see. The noise grew louder, then faded, swallowed by the storm. Technical vehicles, Porter said. He didn't need to say more. Everyone in the squad knew what that meant. Pickup trucks with heavy weapons mounted in the beds. Fast, mobile, deadly if they caught you in the open. The sound came again, from a different direction this time, closer. Hale's mind went through the calculus in seconds. They were compromised. Someone knew they were here, or suspected it enough to send vehicles sweeping the area. Staying put made them a stationary target, but moving blind was just as dangerous. Before he could decide, the first rounds cracked overhead. Not aimed wild, probing fire from somewhere to the east, but close enough that sand kicked up near Boyd's position. The squad reacted instantly, spreading into a wider defensive circle, everyone seeking what little cover existed in the flat terrain. More shots, disciplined 3-round bursts this time. The enemy couldn't see them any better than they could see the enemy, but they didn't need to. They were firing into the storm, creating a wall of lead that would eventually find flesh. Hale keyed his radio again, knowing it was likely useless, but trying anyway. Falcon 6, Viper 1, taking effective fire, unknown number of hostiles, request immediate support. Static, then faintly, so faint he almost missed it beneath the roar of wind and crack of gunfire. Overwatch, positioning. And nothing more. The muzzle flashes appeared as brief orange blooms in the brown haze, gone almost before Hale's brain could register them. Direction, northeast, maybe 40 meters out. Hard to tell when the light diffracted through millions of suspended particles. His squad returned fire, controlled bursts at where the flashes had been. In normal conditions, they'd be calling out targets, coordinating sectors, using their optics to identify and engage. Now, they were shooting at ghosts. An RPG shrieked past, close enough that Hale felt the pressure wave before it detonated somewhere behind them. The explosion was muffled, absorbed by the sand-thick air, but the shrapnel still hummed through the space they occupied. "Contact right," someone shouted. Specialist Aaron Cross, positioned on the southern edge of their perimeter. New muzzle flashes, different angle. The enemy was flanking them, using the storm as cover, just like Hale had feared. They knew this terrain. They'd probably lived in it their whole lives. Learned to navigate by feel and instinct when the desert decided to erase the world. "Suppressive fire, 3 o'clock, Porter bellowed, his voice barely audible. Half the squad shifted, pouring rounds into the haze. It might not hit anything, but it would make the enemy think twice about closing in. Hale's radio crackled. "Viper 1, Falcon, heavy, advise." He couldn't make out half the words. "Falcon 6, say again, you're unreadable." No response. The communication was degrading by the minute. Whatever atmospheric conditions fed the storm were playing hell with their frequencies. Another RPG, this one from the west. It fell short, geysering sand 15 meters away. But the message was clear. They were being boxed in from multiple directions. Boyd appeared at Hale's side, breathing hard through his face covering. "We need to move. They're trying to fix us in place." He was right. Classic ambush tactics. Pin the enemy, flank, destroy. The only reason Hale's squad wasn't already overrun was the storm itself. The enemy couldn't coordinate their assault any better than the Americans could coordinate their defense. "Which direction?" Hale shouted back. Boyd pointed south, away from the heaviest fire. "Break contact that way. Try to link up with Bravo team." Bravo team another squad that had inserted 2 clicks southeast of their position. In normal conditions, a 20-minute movement. In this hell, it might as well be on another planet. But staying meant dying. All right. Hale grabbed Porter's shoulder, pulled him close. We're moving south, bounding Overwatch. You lead the first element. I'll cover with Cross and Martinez. Porter nodded and started organizing the movement. 4 men would move first, while the other 4 provided covering fire. Then they'd leapfrog, keep it going until they broke free of the kill zone. The problem was, in a sandstorm, you couldn't see who you were covering. You just had to trust the plan and hope nobody got left behind. Porter's element surged forward into the murk. Hale counted to 3, then opened fire at where he'd last seen muzzle flashes, pumping rounds downrange more to create noise and chaos than with any hope of hitting targets. Cross and Martinez did the same, their weapons adding to the cacophony. Seconds crawled past. 5, 10, 15. Viper 1, moving! Porter's voice on the squad net, tinny and distorted. Hale grabbed Cross. Let's go! They rose and ran, keeping low, weapons up. The wind hit them full force now that they weren't hunkered down. It was like running through water, every step a struggle. Sand pelted Hale's face mask, found the gaps in his gloves, the seams in his uniform. His goggles were nearly opaque with scratches and accumulated grit. He nearly collided with Porter, who had stopped and taken a knee behind a slight rise in the terrain, barely a meter of elevation. But it was something. Hold here, Porter shouted. Let the others... The burst caught him mid-sentence. 3 rounds, center mass. Porter's body armor took most of it, but the impact knocked him flat. Hale saw him go down, saw Cross drop beside him to check the damage, saw movement in the storm to their left close, too close. He swung his rifle and fired, full automatic, hosing the area where the shooter had to be. Someone screamed, or maybe that was just the wind. Muzzle flashes erupted from 3 different points around them. They were in it now, close quarters, the kind of fight where training and instinct took over and conscious thought became a luxury. Martinez appeared, firing his saw in controlled bursts, laying down a curtain of suppression. Boyd and 2 others materialized from the haze, forming a hasty perimeter around Porter's position. He's hit, Cross yelled. Vest stopped it, but he's got broken ribs for sure. No time for a detailed medical assessment. Hale grabbed Porter's drag handle and started pulling him backward, deeper into the storm, away from the immediate threat. The squad moved with him, walking backward, firing at anything that moved in the brown chaos. Hale's radio chose that moment to deliver a burst of clear transmission. Viper 1, Overwatch has eyes on. Stand by for fire mission. He almost laughed. Eyes on? In this? The drones would be grounded or blown miles off course. Satellite imaging would show nothing but a brown smear across half the province. Whatever Overwatch thought they could do was fantasy. But he acknowledged anyway, because hope was better than nothing. Overwatch, Viper 1, we are danger close to multiple hostiles, taking casualties, need immediate support. The response was maddeningly calm, a woman's voice, cold and professional. Viper 1, Overwatch copies, calculating firing solution, continue evasion, stay low, as if they had a choice. In the Tactical Operations Center, General William Hackett stood before a wall of monitors that showed him everything and nothing. The main screen displayed a satellite feed of the area where Viper 1 and Bravo team had inserted. It showed what he'd been staring at for the past 40 minutes, an amorphous brown stain that covered roughly 80 square kilometers. No definition, no detail, just the visual equivalent of static. The thermal imaging wasn't much better. The suspended sand particles retained heat, creating a diffuse glow that washed out individual signatures. You couldn't tell a human from a vehicle from a burning tire. The drone feed, normally his most reliable source of battlefield awareness, was a joke. 2 Reapers had been repositioned to provide overwatch, but they were being thrown around like kites in the upper atmosphere, burning fuel just to maintain station. Their cameras showed the same thing the satellite did, Nothing useful. Captain Reeves stood beside him, tablet in hand, coordinating with multiple units across 3 radio nets simultaneously. His expression was carefully neutral, but Hackett could read the tension in his shoulders, the way his jaw muscles worked. "Status on Bravo team?" Hackett asked. "Still holding position 3 clicks southeast of Viper 1's last known," Reeves replied. "They're taking sporadic fire, but nothing they can't handle. Visibility near 0 there, too." "And Viper 1? Last transmission was 3 minutes ago. They're under sustained contact, enemy strength unknown, attempting to break south toward Bravo's position." 3 minutes. In a gunfight, that was a lifetime. Hackett studied the screens, looking for something, anything that would give him an option. Artillery was too imprecise even with GPS guidance. The margin of error in these winds could put rounds on top of his own people. Fast air couldn't see targets to engage. Ground reinforcements would take too long and arrive just as blind as everyone else. He'd been in command positions for 28 years. He'd managed operations across 4 continents, made decisions that determined whether men lived or died, learned to function in the space between perfect information and paralysis. This was different. This was sending people into darkness and hoping they found their way out. "Sir," a lieutenant at one of the auxiliary stations turned in his chair. "Overwatch reports ready." Hackett glanced at the feed labeled Overwatch Actual. It showed an elevated position approximately 6 kilometers northeast of Viper 1's last known location. A single operator, prone behind a rifle, situated on a ridgeline that rose just high enough to theoretically look down into the valley where the ambush was unfolding. Theoretically, because right now that ridgeline was being sandblasted by the same storm that was devouring his squad. The operator was Staff Sergeant Claire Donovan. Hackett had reviewed her file when she'd been assigned to his task force 3 months ago. Prior service as a designated marksman with the 75th Ranger Regiment. Then selection for specialized long-range reconnaissance. Numerous deployments, commendations for actions that were mostly classified. Her longest confirmed kill was 1,900 meters, made in Afghanistan during a hostage rescue that went sideways. That shot had been made in perfect conditions, clear day, light wind, target stationary in an open courtyard. This was not that. "Get her on the command net," Hackett said. A moment later, Donovan's voice came through, filtered through layers of encryption and atmospheric interference, but still remarkably clear. "Overwatch standing by." Hackett picked up the handset himself, bypassing the usual chain of communication. "Sergeant Donovan, this is General Hackett. What can you see?" "Sir, visibility is approximately 30 meters maximum from my position. I have thermals, but they're degraded. No clear sight lines to the valley floor. Wind is 60+ knots, gusting higher. Conditions are beyond effective range for precision fire." "Honest?" He appreciated that. Some operators would have tried to sound confident, promised miracles. She was giving him the truth. "Can you see anything at all?" he pressed. A pause, then, "I can see patterns. Movement signatures when the wind drops for a few seconds. Muzzle flashes, rough bearing and distance to sound sources. Sir, if you're asking whether I can make a shot that matters, the answer is no one should be able to make that shot." "But can you?" Another pause, longer this time. "Sir, I need to clarify something. Any fire mission I conduct from this position has significant risk of collateral impact on friendly forces. The wind variance alone creates a 50-meter probable error at this range. I can't guarantee." "Sergeant," Hackett interrupted, his voice quiet but firm, "I'm not asking for guarantees. I'm asking if you can help those men." The silence stretched. In the background of her transmission, he could hear the scream of wind over exposed rock, the occasional ping of debris hitting equipment. Finally, "I can try, sir." "Then try. Viper 1 is priority. Any shot that disrupts the enemy assault will give them a chance to break contact." "Understood. Overwatch is engaging." Hackett put down the handset and returned his attention to the useless monitors. Beside him, Reeves was very carefully not looking at him. "Sir," Reeves said quietly, "we're asking her to shoot blind into a situation where she's just as likely to hit our people as theirs. I know what I'm asking, Captain. With respect, sir, if this goes wrong, if we do nothing, it goes wrong anyway. Hackett cut him off. Viper 1 is 30 seconds from being overrun. We have no other assets that can reach them in time, so yes, I'm authorizing a blind fire mission from a sniper who has maybe a 5% chance of hitting anything useful, because 5% is better than 0. Reeves said nothing more. On one of the smaller monitors, Hackett could see the feed from Donovan's position camera, a fixed view of the ridgeline showing her prone silhouette behind the rifle. She wasn't moving, wasn't adjusting, just lying there staring into the storm. He'd seen a lot of snipers in his career. The good ones all had a quality he could never quite describe, stillness that went beyond physical immobility. They could wait like stone, patient and cold, until the moment came. Donovan had that quality. Hackett found himself thinking about a question someone had once asked him years ago about what made a truly exceptional marksman. He'd given some textbook answer about training and temperament, but the truth was simpler and stranger. The best ones could feel things that shouldn't be felt, wind that hadn't arrived yet, the moment before a target moved, the shape of probability in three-dimensional space. Most people called it instinct. He had another word for it, though he'd never said it out loud. Witchcraft. Who taught you to shoot? He murmured, too quiet for anyone else to hear. On the screen, Donovan still hadn't moved. Claire Donovan lay behind her rifle and watched the world dissolve. The ridgeline she'd chosen was technically perfect, high enough for elevation advantage, positioned with a clear line of sight into the valley where the operation was supposed to unfold, sheltered by an outcropping that provided some protection from the prevailing winds. Technically perfect for a normal day. Today, it was an exposed platform at the edge of chaos. The storm moved around her like a living thing, not constant but pulsing, breathing. Sand hit her face shield in waves, each gust carrying a different density of particles, a different angle of attack. Her rifle, secured to a bipod and weighted to prevent movement, still vibrated with each impact. She'd wrapped the scope in a thin layer of microfiber cloth, leaving just enough gap to see through. Already that gap was clouding with fine dust that found its way past every seal she'd created. Through the scope, the valley was an impressionistic smear of brown and amber. No hard edges, no defined shapes, just gradients of opacity that shifted and reformed with every heartbeat. Her spotter, Corporal Nathan Price, lay beside her with a spotting scope that was equally useless. He'd given up trying to call wind conditions 5 minutes ago. There was no point. The wind wasn't behaving like wind should. It gusted, swirled back on itself, created vortices that spun off in random directions. "I've got nothing," Price said, his voice barely audible through his face covering. "Can't even guess at a firing solution." Claire didn't respond. She was listening. Not with her ears. The storm was too loud for that. A sustained roar that erased all other sounds. But with something else, some part of her awareness that had developed over years of this work, she could feel the rhythm in the chaos. The gusts weren't random. They came in sets, built to a peak, then dropped for a few seconds before building again. The timing varied, but the pattern held. Rising action, climax, brief calm, then repeat. During those calm moments, maybe 3 seconds, maybe 5, the brown haze thinned just slightly. Not enough to see clearly, but enough to see differently. She watched and waited, letting the storm teach her its tempo. Her radio crackled. "Overwatch, Viper 1, we are breaking south, taking casualties. Need you to hit anything that moves in Sector 4-7. Sector 4-7. She knew the grid coordinates by heart, had them marked on her mental map of the valley. Approximately 1,800 meters at a bearing of 245 degrees from her position. In normal conditions, a challenging but makeable shot. These weren't normal conditions. Claire keyed her mic. "Viper 1, I have no visual on Sector 4-7. Stand by." "Overwatch, we don't have time to stand by. We are danger close, I say again. Danger close to multiple." The transmission dissolved into static and gunfire. Price looked at her. "Claire, you can't." "I know." But she stayed behind the rifle, watching the storm breathe. Another gust, building, peaking, then the 3-second window. During that brief calm, a patch of the valley floor became visible, maybe 100 meters wide. She saw movement, dark shapes against slightly lighter sand. Vehicles, at least 2, probably technicals based on the size. They were moving fast, paralleling what would be Viper 1's likely escape route. The wind rose again, erasing everything. Claire made calculations that had nothing to do with ballistics tables. She was thinking in terms of pressure waves, how sand moved through air at different densities, how sound traveled through a medium that was half atmosphere and half solid particle. The vehicles had been moving at roughly 30 kilometers per hour. If they maintained that speed and direction, they'd be in a position to cut off Viper 1's retreat in the next 60 seconds. She needed to hit them before that happened. Price was talking, saying something about the impossibility of the shot, about wind variance and trajectory arc and minimum engagement parameters. She heard him, but didn't process the words. She was inside the scope now, inside the space between her position and the target area, feeling the topology of the storm. Another set building, rising. She adjusted her aim point, not based on where the vehicles were, but where they would be during the next calm window, factoring in their speed and the time it would take her bullet to travel 1,800 meters through a sandstorm. The wind peaked and began to drop. 3 seconds, maybe 4. The valley cleared slightly. She saw the technicals right where she'd predicted, still moving fast. No time to identify which one was more dangerous, no time to calculate which presented a better target profile. She picked the lead vehicle because it was half a meter ahead of the other. Her finger rested on the trigger. She wasn't thinking about recoil management or sight picture or any of the mechanical aspects of shooting. Those were background processes now, muscle memory refined through tens of thousands of practice rounds. She was thinking about the space between the rifle and the truck, visualizing it as a curved path through 3-dimensional chaos. She was thinking about how the bullet would encounter different wind conditions at different altitudes, how it would drift and drop and tumble, how all those variables would interact to move the projectile in ways that no computer could calculate. The wind dropped to its lowest point. Now, she squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked against her shoulder, the suppressor reducing but not eliminating the sharp crack of the round, leaving the barrel. The scope jolted off target, and by the time she reacquired her sight picture, the storm had closed back in. She had no idea if she'd hit anything. Viper 1, Overwatch, shot fired, bearing 245, estimate danger close 50 meters, mark your location. No response. Price was staring at her. "Did you just call it?" she said. He understood immediately. Even though he hadn't seen the shot, hadn't been able to spot the impact, he keyed his radio and spoke with false confidence. "Viper 1, Overwatch has splashed 1 technical, continuing observation." Still no response from Hale's squad. But 30 seconds later, another voice came through on the command net. It was General Hackett himself speaking directly to her. "Overwatch, be advised, Viper 1 reports enemy contact broken on their southern flank. Status of hostile vehicles unknown. Can you confirm?" Claire watched the valley through her scope, waiting for another window. "Negative, sir, no visual confirmation. I can fire again if you need me to." "Stand by, Overwatch." She stayed behind the rifle, watching the storm breathe. Marcus Hale didn't see the technical explode. He was too busy dragging Kyle Porter through the sand, weapon in one hand, Porter's drag handle in the other, moving in a crouch that made his thighs scream. What he saw was the sudden absence of incoming fire from the southern flank. One moment rounds were snapping past from that direction, chewing up the ground, keeping his squad pinned. The next moment, nothing, just the wind and the pop of fire from other directions. "South is clear," Boyd shouted, though clear was a relative term in this hell. He meant clear enough to move through without immediately dying. They ran. 8 men, 1 injured, moving as fast as the sand and wind would allow. No formation, no tactical spacing, just desperate movement away from the kill zone. Hale didn't look back, didn't try to assess what had happened to the enemy position that had been about to overrun them. He just moved. After 200 meters, he called a halt. The squad collapsed into a hasty perimeter, everyone gasping through their face coverings, gulping superheated air mixed with dust. "Head count," Hale barked. Boyd called out names, got 8 responses. Everyone still mobile, though Porter was holding his ribs and his breathing sounded wrong. "What the hell happened?" Martinez asked. "Why'd they stop shooting?" No one had an answer. In the chaos, it was impossible to know what had changed. Maybe the enemy had lost track of them in the storm. Maybe they'd decided the risk wasn't worth it. Maybe. Hale's radio crackled. "Viper 1, Falcon 6, say status." Reception was slightly better now, though still fragmented. Hale gave a quick sit-rep. "Contact broken, 1 casualty but mobile. Continuing movement toward Bravo's position." "Copy, Viper 1. Be advised. Overwatch engaged enemy vehicles on your southern flank. Can't confirm effectiveness of fire, but timing suggests hostile advance was disrupted." Overwatch. That sniper on the ridgeline, the one who'd been setting up when they inserted. Hale tried to visualize the geometry. She was how far away? 6 clicks? 7? In a sandstorm where you couldn't see 30 meters? He keyed his mic. "Falcon 6, confirm Overwatch fired from ridgeline position." "Affirmative. In these conditions." "Affirmative?" Hale looked at Boyd, who had clearly heard the exchange through his own radio. Boyd's expression, visible only as a suggestion through his sand-caked goggles, communicated perfect disbelief. "She hit a moving vehicle in a sandstorm from 7,000 meters? Boyd's voice was flat. "Apparently. That's not possible. Tell that to whoever stopped shooting at us." They resumed movement, angling southeast toward where Bravo team should be. The storm showed no signs of abating. If anything, it was intensifying, the wind now strong enough that walking into it required leaning forward at an angle that would have looked absurd in any other context. 15 minutes of brutal progress brought them to a series of low dunes that provided marginal shelter. Hale called another halt to check Porter's injuries and give everyone a chance to clear sand from their weapons. His radio came alive again, this time with a transmission that was surprisingly clear. It was the same woman's voice he'd heard before, cool and professional. "Viper 1. Overwatch has movement signatures on thermal, bearing 180 from your position, range approximately 400 meters. Assess as hostile patrol, 2 vehicles, dismounted personnel. They appear to be searching for the Americans." Of course they were. Just because Viper 1 had broken contact didn't mean the enemy had given up. They knew there were foreign troops in the area, and they'd keep hunting until the storm passed and they could confirm kills or determine their targets had escaped. "Overwatch, Viper 1, can you engage those targets?" Hale asked. A pause, probably while she calculated angles and distances. "Viper 1, negative. They're in a depression, below my line of sight. Recommend you stay low and continue evasion. I'll track them and advise if they adjust course toward your position." It was strange, having this invisible guardian watching over them through a storm that blinded everyone else. Hale had worked with sniper teams before, relied on their overwatch during operations in Iraq and Afghanistan, but those had been line-of-sight relationships. He could see the snipers, they could see him. Everyone operated in the same visible battlefield. This was different. This was faith in someone he couldn't see, trusting that she could interpret thermal shadows and movement patterns through a sandstorm and somehow translate that into actionable intelligence. "Copy, Overwatch. Continuing movement southeast. Advise if threat posture changes." "Wilco." They moved again, using the dunes as concealment, staying low. The world remained a claustrophobic bubble of swirling brown, but now Hale felt slightly less blind. Somewhere up on that ridgeline, someone was watching. 10 minutes later, Overwatch transmitted again. "Viper 1, hostile patrol changing direction. Now bearing 090, moving away from your position. Assess they've lost your track. Small victories. Another 20 minutes of movement, and a new voice came through on the radio, Lieutenant Sarah Chen, commanding Bravo Team. Viper 1, Bravo 1, we have you on thermals, range 200 meters, bearing 330 from our POs. Suggest you angle right and come in from the north. Friendlies. Finally. The link-up happened slowly, carefully, both teams aware that in these conditions, trigger discipline was everything. You didn't want to shoot your own people because you couldn't recognize them until you were 10 feet away. Chen appeared out of the murk, weapon ready but pointed low. She looked as sand-blasted and exhausted as Hale felt. Her squad formed a perimeter around the expanded group, 14 men now, enough to provide actual security. Heard you had a rough morning, Chen said. You could say that. Hale looked southeast, toward where Bravo had been holding position. How's your situation? Few probing attacks, nothing sustained. They seem more interested in finding you than engaging us. That made tactical sense. Bravo had fortified positions, however makeshift. Hale's squad had been caught in the open, identified as the softer target. His radio, Viper 1, Falcon 6, weather update shows storm beginning to weaken. Estimate visibility will improve in the next 30 minutes. Stand by for extraction plan. 30 minutes. They just had to survive 30 more minutes. Hale acknowledged and looked up at the ridgeline he couldn't see, somewhere to the northeast. Overwatch, Viper 1, thanks for the assist. We'll owe you a beer when this is done. A brief pause, then, Overwatch copies, stay safe down there. Something in her tone, not quite emotion, but an acknowledgement of the absurdity they were all sharing. You're welcome for the impossible shots I made that probably shouldn't have worked, but did. The storm continued to rage, but for the first time since dawn, Hale felt like they might actually make it out. Claire Donovan remained motionless behind her rifle while the command net chattered with evacuation logistics. 2 Blackhawks would attempt extraction once visibility improved to marginal flying conditions. The combined force of Viper 1 and Bravo 1 would move to a cleared zone 3 kilometers southwest of their current position. Artillery was being pre-positioned to provide cover fire if enemy forces attempted to interfere with the pickup. Standard procedure, professionally executed, everything proceeding according to contingency plans that had been drafted months ago for situations exactly like this. But Claire wasn't listening to any of that. She was watching a thermal signature that had appeared on the western edge of her observation area 3 minutes ago. Price saw it too. We've got another vehicle, maybe 2, moving northeast toward the extraction zone. Claire adjusted her scope, trying to get better resolution through the degraded thermal imaging. The storm was still too thick for visual confirmation, but the heat signatures were distinct enough, definitely vehicles moving with purpose. She calculated vectors in her head. If the friendlies moved at their current pace toward the extraction zone, and if the vehicles maintained their course and speed, they'd intercept within 20 minutes, well before the helicopters could arrive. Command net, she said quietly. Price switched frequencies and handed her the handset. Falcon 6, Overwatch, I have vehicle movement heading toward likely intercept with extraction plan. 2 contacts, assess as hostile technicals bearing 273 from our position, range 2,000 meters and closing. Captain Reeves responded immediately. Overwatch, can you engage? Claire studied the signatures through her thermal optic. The vehicles were moving faster than the first ones had been, traveling across relatively flat terrain. Less predictable than a chase situation, but still trackable. Stand by. She ran the numbers. Range would be approximately 2,200 meters when the vehicles reached the most open section of their route, a slight rise where they'd be briefly exposed on her line of sight. Wind was still erratic, but the pattern held, gusts followed by brief calm. If she timed it right, if the vehicles maintained speed, if the wind cooperated. Too many ifs. Overwatch can attempt engagement, she transmitted. No guarantee of effectiveness. Request permission to fire. General Hackett's voice came through this time. Overwatch, you are authorized at your discretion. At your discretion, which meant you decide if it's worth taking the shot, knowing you might miss, knowing you're expending ammunition and giving away your position, knowing that failure means those men on the ground have one less option when things go wrong. Claire settled deeper into her position and began the familiar ritual of preparation. First, she confirmed her rifle's zero hadn't shifted from the vibration and impacts of the storm. She dry-fired twice, checking trigger pull and scope alignment. Everything felt solid. Second, she updated her atmospheric readings. Temperature rising as the sun climbed higher despite the storm. Barometric pressure fluctuating wildly. Humidity negligible. Wind still chaotic, but she'd mapped its rhythm now, knew when the calms would come. Third, she visualized the path of her bullet from muzzle to target, seeing it as a curved line through three-dimensional space, bending and drifting, affected by gravity and air resistance and the Coriolis effect and a dozen other forces that were all amplified by the storm. Then she waited. The vehicles continued northeast. She tracked them through the thermal, watching their progress, predicting where they'd be during the next clear window. "Range 2200, Price called softly. "They're about to hit that open section." "I see them." The wind began its cycle again, building, rising to a howl, then dropping. The brief, clear window opened. Through her scope, she could barely make out the shapes of the vehicles, dark smudges against lighter sand. They were moving fast, bouncing over rough terrain. She'd have one shot, maybe two if she worked the bolt fast enough, but realistically one. Lead vehicle or trail. The lead would be easier, it was slightly ahead, slightly more exposed. But if she missed, it would alert both crews that someone was shooting at them. They'd scatter, make themselves harder targets. The trail vehicle was partially obscured by dust kicked up by the lead. Harder shot, but if she hit it, the lead might not realize what happened immediately. They'd keep going while she reloaded, giving her a chance at a second shot. She aimed for the trail vehicle. The math was impossible. She was asking a bullet to travel 2,200 meters through a sandstorm with winds gusting up to 60 knots to hit a target moving at 40 kilometers per hour over uneven ground during a 3-second window of minimal visibility. The ballistics computer in her scope was flashing error codes, telling her the shot exceeded its calculation parameters. She ignored it. This wasn't about computers or formulas. This was about reading the storm, feeling the rhythm, knowing when the chaos would pause long enough for physics to work in her favor. The wind was at its lowest point. She squeezed the trigger. The rifle recoiled, the scope lifted off target, and by the time she reacquired sight picture, the storm had closed back in. No way to know if she'd hit. She worked the bolt, chambered another round, and waited for the next clear window. It came 15 seconds later. Through the thinned haze, she saw one vehicle stopped at an angle, probably disabled. The other was still moving, but slower now. The driver possibly confused about what had happened to his companion. She aimed, adjusted for the new variables, and fired again. This time, when the storm cleared slightly, both vehicles were motionless. "Splash 2, Price said, his voice carrying a note of disbelief he couldn't quite suppress. "Holy hell, Claire." She didn't respond. She was already scanning for new threats, watching the thermals, looking for any other signatures that might interfere with the extraction. On the command net, Reeves was updating the ground teams. "All elements. Overwatch has neutralized vehicles approaching extraction zone. Continue movement to pickup point as planned." Claire heard acknowledgments from multiple call signs, heard the renewed energy in their voices now that one more obstacle had been removed from their path. She made a note in her logbook, mechanical habit. 2 rounds fired, both at extreme range, both targets disabled or destroyed. She'd do the formal after-action report later, include all the environmental conditions and decision factors. But the truth was simpler than any report would capture. She'd fired blind into a sandstorm, and somehow, impossibly, the bullets had found their targets. Price was looking at her with an expression she'd seen before, a mix of respect and something else. Not quite fear, but an awareness that he'd just witnessed something outside normal human capability. "Want to tell me how you did that?" he asked. Claire kept her eye on the scope. "Did what?" "Made 2 impossible shots in a sandstorm." "They weren't impossible, just improbable." "That's not an answer." She finally looked at him, her face still covered by her wrap, only her eyes visible. "I don't have a better answer. I've been shooting long enough that sometimes I know things I shouldn't know. I knew when the wind would drop. I knew where those vehicles would be. I knew the bullet path would clear. That's not training. That's something else. Call it whatever you want." She returned to scanning through her scope. It worked. Price didn't push further. Some things you didn't question, especially when they kept your teammates alive. The storm continued for another 20 minutes before finally beginning to break. Visibility improved from 30 meters to 50, then 100. Then suddenly the southern horizon appeared, sharp and clear. The wall of brown retreating north like a curtain being drawn. The extraction helicopters came in low and fast, flared hard, and the combined squads loaded within 90 seconds. Claire watched through her scope as the Blackhawks lifted off, banked away, and accelerated toward the FOB. Mission complete. Everyone going home. She began breaking down her position, packing equipment with the methodical care of someone who'd done this hundreds of times. Price helped, neither of them speaking much. Their own extraction, a ground vehicle that had been waiting on the far side of the ridge, would arrive in 10 minutes. While they waited, Claire allowed herself a moment to look out at the valley where she'd been shooting. The storm had passed completely now, leaving behind a landscape that looked scrubbed clean, all the loose sand carried away, exposing the harder stone underneath. She could see where the vehicles had stopped. Dark shapes in the distance, too far away to make out details but clearly disabled. 2 shots, 2 hits. In her career, she'd made more difficult shots in better conditions, but she'd never made shots that mattered more. "You ever going to tell anyone how you actually do this?" Price asked. Claire smiled, though he couldn't see it behind her face covering. "If I told them, they wouldn't believe me anyway." "Try me." She considered for a moment, then said, "You know how some people can tell when someone's watching them? How your skin prickles right before a storm hits? How you sometimes know the phone's going to ring before it does?" Price nodded slowly. "It's like that, but with bullets and wind and distance. I can feel the shape of the shot before I take it. Can't explain it better than that." "That's insane." "Probably, but it works." They finished packing in silence. The valley stretched out below them, empty and serene now that the violence had passed. Somewhere down there, an enemy force was trying to figure out what had hit them from an impossible distance in impossible conditions. Let them wonder, Claire thought. Some mysteries didn't need solving. 3 days later, in a conference room at the Forward Operating Base, General Hackett convened an after-action review. The room was crowded, both squad leaders, their senior NCOs, intelligence officers, air support coordinators, logistics personnel. Everyone who had played a role in the operation pulled together to dissect what went right and what went wrong. Claire sat near the back beside Price. She'd submitted her formal report the previous day. 2 pages of clinical prose detailing range, wind conditions, atmospheric factors, decision timeline, and ammunition expenditure. It was the kind of document that would be filed, reviewed by people who needed to understand resource allocation, and then forgotten. The meat of the meeting was video analysis, drone footage, helmet cam recordings, radio transcripts. They walked through the operation chronologically, pausing at decision points to discuss alternatives and outcomes. When they reached the section covering the ambush, Hackett paused the playback. "This is where communication degraded completely," he said. "For approximately 15 minutes, we had no reliable contact with Viper 1. Ground commander was making decisions with no support from command, no air cover, and near zero visibility." He advanced the timeline. At 0827, Viper 1 reported taking casualties and attempting to break south. At 0829, we authorized Overwatch to engage targets of opportunity despite conditions being well outside normal engagement parameters. The room was silent. Everyone knew what came next. Hackett pulled up a satellite image taken 2 hours after the storm cleared. It showed the valley from above with notations marking where the squads had been, where the enemy had positioned themselves, and where 2 destroyed vehicles sat at angles suggesting violent sudden stops. Technical assessment concludes both vehicles were struck by large-caliber precision fire, Hackett continued. 1 round penetrated the engine block of the first vehicle, causing catastrophic mechanical failure. The second round struck the driver of the second vehicle through the windshield. Both shots were made at a range exceeding 2,000 meters, in wind conditions that made visual acquisition nearly impossible. He looked directly at Claire. "Staff Sergeant Donovan, would you care to explain how you accomplished this?" Claire stood, uncomfortable with the attention. "Sir, I had a narrow window during brief calms in the storm. Thermal imaging gave me approximate target locations. I calculated probable intercept points based on vehicle speed and direction, then waited for visibility to improve enough for final targeting." It was a truthful answer as far as it went. It just didn't capture the strange intuition that had actually guided her hands. Hackett studied her for a moment. "And the wind correction? Our meteorological data shows gusts varying between 40 and 70 knots during that time frame, with directional shifts of up to 30 degrees. How did you calculate holdover and drift?" Claire chose her words carefully. "Sir, I observed the pattern of wind behavior and timed my shots for the most stable moments. I also accounted for the probability that the storm would create a partial wind shadow effect at certain altitudes." "Probability," Hackett repeated. "So you're saying you guessed, in the sense that all long-range shooting involves predictive modeling with incomplete data?" "Yes, sir. I made my best estimate based on available information and took the shot." One of the intelligence officers, a major Claire didn't know, spoke up. "General, with respect to the sergeant's capabilities, I think we need to acknowledge that this engagement fell well outside established doctrine for sniper operations. The probability of success, statistically speaking, was—" "Yet she succeeded," Hackett interrupted. "Twice, which raises an interesting question. Was this luck or skill?" The room waited. "I've reviewed Sergeant Donovan's service record," Hackett continued. "Multiple confirmed kills at extreme range. Consistently rated as the top marksman in her unit, recommended for specialized training programs. This wasn't an aberration. This is a pattern of performance that suggests capability beyond standard metrics." He paused, then asked the question that had apparently been bothering him. "Who taught you to shoot, Sergeant?" Claire hesitated. It was a simple question with a complicated answer. "My father, initially, sir. He was a competitive shooter, then Marine Corps basic marksmanship, then Ranger School, then specialized courses at Quantico and Fort Benning, and experience." "Experience," Hackett echoed. "You mean you've learned things that aren't in the manuals?" "Yes, sir. Every shooter develops their own approach over time. You learn what works for you, personally, through repetition and feedback. And what you learned is how to make shots that violate the laws of physics?" A few people in the room chuckled nervously. Claire didn't smile. "No, sir. I learned how to work within the laws of physics even when the conditions seem impossible. There's always a moment, always a path. You just have to recognize it." Hackett nodded slowly, as if that confirmed something he'd already suspected. "The doctrine will say you shouldn't have taken those shots, that the risk outweighed the potential benefit, that we got lucky." He looked around the room. "I'm here to tell you that doctrine is wrong." Sergeant Donovan assessed the situation, calculated risks and benefits, and made a professional judgment call that saved American lives. That's exactly what we train our people to do. The fact that she has skills that exceed our standard models doesn't make her reckless, makes her valuable. He turned back to Claire. "I'm putting you in for a commendation. I'm also recommending you for instructor duty at the Advanced Marksmanship Program. We need to figure out how to teach what you do, or at least identify others who might have similar aptitude." Claire felt her stomach tighten. Instructor duty meant being pulled off operational assignments, stuck in a classroom, trying to explain intuitions that she barely understood herself. "Sir, I prefer to remain with my current unit." "I'm aware of your preference, Sergeant, but we have an obligation to the force as a whole. What you did out there isn't just an individual achievement, it's a capability gap we need to address. Too many situations where our standard approaches fail. We need people who can operate in the margins." He softened slightly. "I'm not making any immediate moves, but think about it. And in the meantime, write up everything you can about how you prepare for extreme range shots. Environmental factors you consider, mental approach, anything that might be teachable. Even if only 10% of it translates to other shooters, that's worth the effort." Claire sat back down, knowing there was no point in arguing further. Hackett had made up his mind. The meeting continued, covering other aspects of the operation, discussing equipment performance and communication protocols and a dozen other technical details, but Claire barely heard any of it. She kept thinking about that question, who taught you to shoot? The truth was, no one had taught her the things that really mattered. Not her father, not the Marines, not any of the specialized courses. They'd taught her the mechanics, the fundamentals, the repeatable skills that made her competent. But the other stuff, the ability to read invisible patterns, to feel the shape of wind she couldn't see, to know when the chaos would pause, that hadn't come from any instructor. It had come from somewhere else. Maybe from the thousands of hours behind a rifle, letting her subconscious learn things her conscious mind couldn't articulate. Maybe from some genetic quirk that made her nervous system process spatial information differently. Maybe from pure chance, a lottery of talent that had nothing to do with effort or training. She didn't know. And the not knowing bothered her less than the idea of trying to explain it to people who expected concrete answers. After the meeting dispersed, Marcus Hale caught up with her in the hallway. "Hey," he said, "didn't get a chance to say this properly before, but thanks for pulling our asses out of the fire." Claire nodded. "Just doing my job." "Bullshit. You did something I've never seen anyone do. I've worked with a lot of snipers over the years, good ones, and none of them would have taken that shot." "Maybe they should have," Hale smiled. "Maybe. Or maybe you're just wired different." He extended his hand. "Either way, if you ever need someone to buy you that beer, you've got a standing invitation. Viper 1 owes you one." They shook hands, and Hale walked away. Claire stood in the empty hallway listening to the ambient sounds of the base generators humming, vehicles passing outside, voices from distant rooms. She thought about Hackett's question again, turning it over in her mind like a puzzle with no solution. Who taught you to shoot? Nobody, she thought, and everybody. And maybe just the wind itself, patient teacher of the impossible. The video footage didn't show anything useful. Captain David Reeves had watched it 17 times now, sitting alone in his office at Aero 200, unable to sleep. The feed was from Claire Donovan's position camera, the one that recorded her prone silhouette behind the rifle. He'd watched her make both shots, watched her lie absolutely still for long stretches, barely seeming to breathe. Watched her make minute adjustments to the rifle, shifts so small they were almost imperceptible. Watched her fire, work the bolt, fire again. The footage was technically perfect, clear image, stable frame rate, no corruption. And it told him nothing. He couldn't see what she saw through the scope, couldn't hear what she heard, couldn't access whatever internal calculus had guided her decisions. From an external view, it just looked like a person lying behind a gun and pulling a trigger twice. The miracle was invisible. Reeves closed the video file and opened the meteorological data instead. This was his third time through the weather logs, cross-referencing them with the timestamps of the shots. At 08:29:34, when Donovan fired her first round, the wind at her position was recorded at 58 knots, gusting to 63. Direction 287 degrees, varying 22 degrees. Temperature 34°C. Barometric pressure fluctuating due to the storm system. At that range, with those conditions, The drift on her bullet should have been catastrophic. Even accounting for the brief calm she'd mentioned, the margin of error exceeded the width of the target vehicle by a factor of 3. Statistically, she shouldn't have hit anything, but she had. Reeves pulled up the technical assessment report that had been filed by the engineers who'd examined the destroyed vehicles after the storm cleared. The first technical had taken a round through the engine block at an angle suggesting the shot had come from elevated northeast position consistent with Donovan's location. Forensic analysis of the bullet path indicated the round had traveled approximately 1,800 meters through multiple layers of atmosphere with different wind conditions before striking the target. The second vehicle showed even more impressive precision. The round had entered through the windshield, struck the driver, and exited through the rear cab wall. The angle was steep, suggesting the shot had been taken when the vehicle was in motion, climbing a slight incline. Both hits sent her mass on their targets, both instant kills. Reeves stood and walked to the window of his office. Outside, the base was quiet in the pre-dawn darkness. Lights glowed from essential facilities, and the distant sound of a generator provided a steady hum. He was an analyst by training, someone who believed in data and models and repeatable processes. His job was to take chaos and find patterns, to build understanding from evidence. But every time he looked at the data from that operation, his models broke down. The shots shouldn't have worked, yet they did. Donovan's explanation that she'd timed the shots for moments of relative calm was technically plausible but practically insufficient. Even in the calms, the conditions exceeded safe engagement parameters by any standard doctrine, which left two possibilities. Either she'd gotten incredibly lucky twice in a row, or she possessed some capability that wasn't captured by standard metrics. Reeves was starting to believe the latter. His computer pinged with an incoming message. He returned to his desk and opened a note from General Hackett, time-stamped just minutes ago. Apparently, he wasn't the only one having trouble sleeping. "Captain, I want a full probability analysis of Donovan's shots, not the official version, the real one. What were the actual odds of success given the conditions? And more importantly, can we identify other personnel with similar aptitude? This isn't about glorifying one shooter. It's about understanding if we have a capability gap we're not training for." Hackett. Reeves read the message twice, then began drafting his response. It took him 40 minutes to articulate what his gut already knew. "General, probability analysis suggests success rate for those engagements should have been 2%, even accounting for shooter skill. The fact that SSG Donovan achieved a 100% success rate indicates she's operating with information or instinct that exceeds our current assessment methodology. In identifying similar aptitude, this will be difficult. Standard marksmanship evaluations measure mechanical skill and consistency under controlled conditions. What Donovan demonstrated was adaptive capability under chaotic conditions. These may be unrelated skill sets. Recommend we develop new evaluation criteria focused on pattern recognition, decision-making under uncertainty, and performance degradation curves in extreme environments. Will require time and cooperation from training command. Respectfully, Reeves." He sent the message and returned to staring at the meteorological data, as if the numbers would eventually reveal their secrets. They wouldn't. He knew that. Some things couldn't be captured in spreadsheets. Claire spent the week after the operation doing what she always did: routine training, equipment maintenance, physical fitness, and the endless administrative tasks that accompanied military service. She wrote her detailed report about environmental factors and preparation methods, as Hackett had requested. It ran to 11 pages and contained everything she could articulate about her process. She suspected it wouldn't be particularly useful. Reading about pattern recognition wasn't the same as developing the ability to recognize patterns, but she tried. People treated her differently now. Not overtly, not dramatically, but there was a shift. People who'd nodded politely before now paid closer attention when she spoke. Conversations paused when she entered rooms. She caught people watching her at the range, studying her technique as if they might learn something through observation. She hated it. The attention felt like pressure, an expectation that she'd perform miracles on demand. But the truth was, what she'd done in the sandstorm wasn't reliable or repeatable. It had worked because a dozen variables had aligned in ways she couldn't control or predict. Ask her to do it again tomorrow, and she might fail. On the fifth day, she was at the range, working through her daily routine, 50 rounds at 800 meters, adjusting for the morning wind, focusing on consistency rather than speed when Nathan Price approached. "You've got a visitor," he said. "Some colonel from training command. Wants to talk about the instructor position Hackett mentioned." Claire set down her rifle. "I haven't agreed to that. Pretty sure they're past the asking phase." The colonel was waiting in the administrative building, a lean man in his 50s named Howard Chen. He stood when she entered and offered his hand. "Staff Sergeant Donovan, thank you for making time." They sat at a small conference table. Chen pulled out a tablet and brought up what looked like a training curriculum. "I'll get straight to the point," he said. "General Hackett has asked me to develop a specialized marksmanship program focused on extreme conditions, sandstorms, heavy precipitation, low visibility, high wind. The goal is to train shooters who can operate effectively when standard approaches fail." Claire listened, already seeing where this was going. "We want you to lead the program," Chen continued. "Initial cycle would be 3 months, 16 students, all already qualified as designated marksmen. You'd design the curriculum, run the training, evaluate performance." "I'm not an instructor, sir." "You'd learn, and you have something these students need. You've done what we're asking them to learn." Claire chose her words carefully. "Colonel, with respect, I'm not sure what I did out there is teachable. Some of it was luck, some of it was experience that took years to develop. You can't compress that into a 3-month course." Chen nodded as if he'd expected this response. "I understand your concern, but consider this. Even if only 30% of what you know is transferable, that's still valuable. We're not trying to create 16 copies of you. We're trying to raise the baseline capability of our marksmen so that when conditions deteriorate, they have better tools and better instincts." He pulled up a different screen on his tablet, showing casualty reports from the past 5 years. "Do you know how many operations have been compromised or failed entirely because weather conditions exceeded our engagement parameters? How many times we've had snipers in position, perfectly situated but unable to engage because the manual said conditions were too difficult?" Claire looked at the numbers. They were higher than she'd expected. "We train people to be competent in ideal conditions," Chen said. "But war doesn't care about ideals. We need people who can adapt when the textbook doesn't apply. That's what you did. That's what we need to teach." He leaned back, letting his argument settle. "I'm not asking you to turn students into miracle workers. I'm asking you to show them what's possible and give them frameworks for pushing past the limitations they think they have. 3 months, 1 cycle. After that, if you want to go back to operational work, I'll personally ensure you get assigned wherever you want." Claire was quiet for a long moment. The practical part of her brain said this was a bad idea. Teaching required patience and communication skills she wasn't sure she had. It would take her away from the work she was good at, put her in front of people expecting impossible results. But the other part, the part that remembered lying in a sandstorm, knowing there were men depending on her, knowing that the impossible shot was still worth taking, that part understood Chen's point. "I'll do 1 cycle," she said finally. 3 months, but I'm not promising anything. If the students don't show improvement, or if the whole thing turns out to be a waste of time, I'm done." Chen smiled. "Fair enough. We'll start assembling the class. First session begins in 2 weeks." After he left, Claire sat alone in the conference room, trying to figure out what she'd just agreed to. Teaching people to shoot in sandstorms. Teaching people to make calculations that shouldn't work. Teaching people to trust instincts they weren't sure they had. It sounded insane, but then again, So did everything else she'd done. The sandstorm that had nearly killed 8 men was forgotten within 2 weeks, absorbed into the larger flow of operations and replaced by newer crises. But the question remained. General Hackett kept a copy of the after-action report in his desk, not because he needed to review it for official purposes, but because it fascinated him. He'd read it perhaps 30 times now, always returning to the same section, Donovan's description of how she'd prepared for the shots. I observed the pattern of wind behavior and timed my shots for the most stable moments. Such a simple sentence, such an inadequate explanation. Hackett had been in the military for 3 decades. He'd commanded men in combat, made decisions that determined life or death, seen both triumph and tragedy. He thought he understood the range of human capability, what training could accomplish, what experience could teach, what genetics and circumstance could produce. Donovan's shots challenged that understanding. There was a moment in every military career, he believed, where you encountered something that couldn't be easily categorized, a decision that worked despite violating doctrine, a victory that emerged from certain defeat, a person who did things that shouldn't be possible. Those moments were important because they reminded you that warfare, for all its technology and planning and precision, was fundamentally a human endeavor, and humans were capable of surprising things. He closed the report and looked out at the desert beyond his window. Somewhere out there in a valley that had been consumed by storm and violence and then returned to emptiness, 2 destroyed vehicles sat as evidence of what one person could do when the situation demanded it. He'd asked Donovan who taught her to shoot, knowing there wouldn't be a satisfying answer, because the real teachers weren't people. They were the wind, the distance, the pressure of knowing lives depended on getting it right. You couldn't put that in a curriculum. You couldn't standardize it or replicate it or guarantee it, but you could recognize it when you saw it. And once recognized, you could try, however imperfectly, to create conditions where others might develop the same capabilities. That was the best anyone could do. Hackett picked up his phone and called Training Command, checking on the status of Chen's specialized program. The first class was forming, 16 shooters selected from units across multiple branches. Donovan would begin instruction in 10 days. Would it work? Would she be able to teach what she barely understood herself? Probably not entirely, but even partial success would be worth it. He ended the call and returned to his desk, where new situation reports were already piling up, demanding attention. Operations continuing, threats evolving, the endless cycle of planning and execution that defined his job. But before diving into the new crises, he allowed himself one final thought about that day in the sandstorm. Some questions didn't need verbal answers. When you asked, "Who taught you to shoot?" and the response was saving 8 lives from an impossible distance in impossible conditions, that was answer enough. The storm had passed. The men had survived, and somewhere on a ridgeline, a person had done something that the world would call miraculous, but which she understood simply as doing what needed to be done when everything else had failed. That was the only answer that mattered. End.